Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Negotiator from 1998. This is a movie I've heard talked about a few times offhand, not in super positive terms, but in oh yeah, I've seen that movie, it's pretty good kind of way. And it just happened to pass me by this week, and I was like, yeah, I need something a little simpler to watch this week, for want of a better phrase. Let's watch this. And this movie is interesting, and I'm not still quite sure how I feel about it. I haven't entirely settled, and frankly, I'm not really sure I will, and I'll start to explain why. This is a police genre movie. I'm going to use a real big overarching thing there and then talk about some of the specifics later. Made in the 90s in an era where sort of crime had been on the decline. There was some more attention towards things like police corruption and stuff like that. It's the era of a whole lot of this sort of genre. The late 80s and into the 90s is full of movies about police. And it is largely places them in a positive light, or at least your protagonist, and often is contrasted with a general police force that is shown to be corrupt, incompetent, or actively criminal by comparison. So there's a lot of stories circulating during the late 80s and 90s about sort of these better than the rest of the cops guys. This is particularly interesting, especially given the last few years, in how culturally in the United States we've started to recontextualize our understanding of, well, some people have started to recontextualize their understanding of what the police are and aren't. The visibility towards some of the police misconduct, historically and currently, is becoming more widespread, the recognition of the issues with police and so on. And it's interesting to reflect back on an era where typically police were looked on more favorably, but there was still a recognition that there's issues in policing. Obviously, the issues being addressed in these movies are typically more about corruption rather than an overt critique of policing as a system. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent already. This movie's interesting to watch with the context of the current era, because not only is the police recontextualized in our current culture, but also some aspects of the race relations and things that are actually downplayed significantly in this movie, but are not entirely absent. And I find it additionally interesting because of some of the other comparisons and the thoughts that I had at the time as watching through this. Now, I'm not really big on, as I've talked about before, I'm not really big on military movies, and I'm not really big on police movies. Typically, they start to, at one point or another, skew towards being a little bit too unabashedly congratulatory about those two professions, or skewing too far into the realm of absurdity or some other thing. And it gets weird narratively pretty quickly. But there are some exceptions. And one of the movies I was thinking about while watching this film, that I was thinking about favorably actually, was Law Abiding Citizen. Law Abiding Citizen is a movie I don't think I've talked about on this show before, but it's a movie that's it's pretty good, but nothing about it is great. And yet it's a movie I've probably watched 6 times, maybe more, which puts it in the absolute upper 1%, if not higher, of movies I've seen in terms of the number of viewings I've given it. Law Abiding Citizen's really interesting and is a topic for another day if it ever comes up. And there is a similar but also extremely different dynamic between the two main characters in that film. Now, what makes it even more interesting is that looking up about this movie after, Law Abiding Citizen is directed by the same guy, F. Gary Gray, who has had a rather long and storied career, including having he directed a ton of rather famous music videos, and then has directed a bunch of very successful films, including one of the Fast and Furious movies, and a number of others. Usually not things that are stand out for being like truly incredible, but like somebody who puts out really consistent quality work throughout, several decades of a career, and is still out there doing it now. And it was just interesting to me that the comparison I made in my head, like I wouldn't say that directorially I can point out anything in particular that was like, oh, that is that visual, that cinematography or something like that cues me into this is this director by any means. And though I had heard his name before, like never would have guessed it, and like had to remind myself, oh yeah, what's he done? So it's just interesting to realize that those connections were sort of already in my head without having anything super specific to tie them together. What is interesting is that narratively as well, even though neither of these were written by the director, both films have a lot of sort of parallel through lines, and a lot of their focus is in the same place, where the narrative is really more about a mystery than it is about the drama. It's more about unfolding all of the corners of the story and seeing how two characters play off each other as you learn about them and as you understand their intentions and motivations and the conditions that they're both working under. And I think to that, there's credit due, of course, the writers, but also the director, to sort of show, have good pacing, have good framing, and have good sort of a good grasp of the rate at which the movie, it's sort of an extension of pacing, but the beat to beat elements as well as the shot to shot and scene to scene, in order to give you a satisfying reveal without spoiling it or feeling, as I've talked about before, like the mystery is unfolding too fast or too slow. And I think that all works pretty well. What's also interesting is that my feelings about both films are kind of in parallel, where I don't love this film. But I can't say that it does anything particularly wrong. It is very consistent throughout. It is well paced, it's well shot, it's satisfying to unfold. It's not too smart, it's not too dumb, it's sort of very middle of the road in all aspects. And that makes for a pretty solid film. But it also doesn't make for the most memorable film. So whether or not I remember it is going to be an interesting question in a year. There's some solid writing and some solid performances in this film, but neither of them are really fantastic either. The casting is pretty solid in this film. The two leads are reasonably well cast. I don't love Samuel L. Jackson. He's obviously a cultural touchstone, but he falls very much, pretty consistently into that. The thing I always talk about is he just kind of plays variations on his same character. The exception being in Quentin Tarantino's films, where Tarantino gets more range out of him than anybody else, but he's still in basically the same camp of basically just playing a one character. The other lead is Kevin Spacey. We don't need to rehash that. I will say I don't think he's a particularly fantastic actor historically either, but he also has a whole lot of controversy, and we're not going to dig into that. So we're just kind of not going to talk about it. The two of them and pretty much all of the other minor role casting, of which there are a bunch of not necessarily notable by name, but very visibly recognizable minor actors in a whole lot of different roles, all deliver quality performances pretty consistently across the board. They deliver the dialogue the best they can. They deliver the emotions the best they can. There are a few... What's his name? There's one guy who stands out as being a little bit out of place, but that's just who that guy is. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can... It's Paul fucking Giamatti. That's why. Paul Giamatti doesn't belong in this film. He's a little bit too silly. He's a little bit too Paul Giamatti. And I feel like if you know his work much at all, Paul Giamatti has a lot of range. He's actually probably arguably the best actor in this film, but excuse me, he didn't get great direction. And so he just sort of does a little bit too over the top. And it's kind of interesting to see how, not somebody, he's playing somebody who's a little bit too silly for the tone that the movie ends up in, and sort of shows off the fact that the movie doesn't have a great and consistent tone as a result, because nobody really reels him in, either on the directorial side or on the in world. Nobody is like, hey man, your behavior is kind of inappropriate for this situation, and somehow narratively you're going to be taught a lesson for that behavior. And so that gets into sort of some of the issues of the tone. The tone is fine, and it's pretty level-headed throughout. It's not overly dramatic or melancholic or overly taking itself too seriously in terms of trying to be a hardcore critique of any kind. It also doesn't stray very much into the realm of comedy. It is very briefly touches on some things that are very lightly sort of keep it there to raise the tone and make sure it doesn't get overly dramatic, but it really does not skew into comedy. And that is something that's interesting for the genre and for the sub-genre that this movie fits into, because a lot of movies of the 80s and 90s in the sort of police procedural or whatever rely on some pretty slapsticky or lowbrow or other kinds of tone-breaking humor to break things up deliberately and lighten the load that the movie has, in terms of telling a compelling narrative while not, bogging down and feeling too heavy. So I almost have to give it a special compliment in that regard, if only because it rides that line of, I was going to say mediocrity, but that's unfair. It rides that line of being very well balanced, but unremarkable. Very, very well. And I can't pretend that was accidental, that the only reason they did that is because they were incompetent at everything else. That's clearly not true. There's clearly a lot of finesse going into making this well balanced like that. The flip side of that is this does have some scenes and things that are a little bit too 80s and 90s police movie, where like shootouts and like silly, it's sort of like unreal gun violence and these other things that are very sort of pulpy, bordering on comedic because they're pulpy, sort of detracts from the seriousness. And it really helps me land on what my final disappointment is. Because if there's one thing I had to pick out that I wanted this movie to do better, or more of, or both, is I wanted to see more exploration of the mystery and the sort of procedural part of the police procedural, the detective work, the investigations. That all ends up relegated to sort of a back burner as a driver for the rest of the plot, that the main tension is not about that anymore. And that is a problem for multiple reasons. The main one being just, if that's our driving reason for all of the rest of the plot to exist, then it has to be compelling in its own right, and it has to return to the screen on a regular basis to keep us hooked, so that we're not just thinking, oh, this is just a series of action scenes or scenes with tension because we've already had a bunch and it hasn't been resolved, therefore it must continue. So there's that problem of it being a little bit shallow in the writing and shallow in the composition. The other part that actually stood out more to me, and I had to remind myself of towards the end, is that the beginning of the film opens very strong and then very weak. Because the opening of the film is teaching you about Samuel Jackson's character, that he's this beloved character who is like well known both in private, within the police agency, as well as in public, in the media, as being like incredible at his job and a genuine like hero to the city. And then I don't think this is spoilers to say that he has a falling from grace, and the fall from grace is absurd, because while there is reason for it to happen, the contrivances around it mean that even when the police who end up investigating it, even if they are going to be painted as corrupt, incompetent, like actively stupid or even malicious, that is such a stark contrast to his character as previously presented in the prior 10 minutes of being so like loved and trusted, that even if that wasn't true, it would still be ridiculous that nobody seems to take his side of, hey man, some of what just happened seems a little bit suspicious or a little too convenient. We're definitely going to look into this. But given the context of the beginning of the beginning 10-15 minutes of saying also everybody loves him, the fall from grace is insane. And that really stops being a problem at the hook of the film. There's a moment when it all sort of pops off and the rest of the film starts. And at that point, you start to forget about that. But I don't want to forget about that, because that is a serious problem. We have been taught who this character is, then something happens to him that makes no sense, then he does something that doesn't make a lot of sense, and is not validated by the rest of the screenplay, and then the rest of the movie happens. Does it ruin the movie? No, by no means does it ruin the movie, but it raises issues, and it sort of knocks this down probably by a substantial margin. That said, it might actually be the reason why it sticks in my head longer, of just like, why was that so weird? This movie might end up sticking more just on that premise alone. In the realm of this sort of genre of like 80s and 90s police procedurals and corrupt cop movies, this is never going to end up near the top of my list, but it's pretty solid all around. And so if that's a genre you don't hate or you even like, I think this is a pretty solid film, and it's hard to complain too much. If you can't watch Spacey on screen and don't want to, I totally understand. I think that's a reasonable choice to make. But aside from that, like, this is pretty solid across the board. And, you know, I'm not going to say I wish I had watched it earlier, but I'm pleased with what I spent my time on. I still wish it had a few things done a little better. I think this, with a little bit of finessing, could have been an extraordinary movie. But under the circumstances and at the time it was made, I think this is pretty good. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.